The envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a tombstone, cream-colored paper that cost more than it should. The law firm's name, embossed in gold letters that caught the afternoon light streaming through windows Julie had cleaned that morning before the hospital visit. She stood there with grocery bags still in her hands, organic vegetables for Raymond's restricted diet, the kind that cost 3 times what regular produce cost, and stared at papers that had clearly been placed with theatrical precision, positioned exactly where she would see them first, where they would inflict maximum damage. Ken was gone. His side of the closet gaped empty, hangers swaying slightly from where he had ripped clothes free with obvious haste, and the wedding ring she had saved for 8 months to buy him sat on top of the divorce papers, like a period at the end of a sentence she never wanted to finish. The bedroom smelled faintly of his cologne, that expensive brand he started wearing 6 months ago, the one that smelled different from anything he wore during their marriage, sharper, more aggressive, the scent of a man trying to become someone else entirely. Julie set the groceries down with mechanical precision, her hands steady despite the tremor that wanted to start in her fingers, and walked to Raymond's room, where her son lay curled under blankets decorated with planets and stars, his small body fighting wars inside itself that no child should have to fight. His breathing was labored, that slight whistle in his chest that the doctor said would improve with the right treatment. The treatment their insurance was supposed to cover. The insurance Ken had promised was still active. "Mama?" Raymond's voice was paper-thin, fragile as spun glass. "Right here, baby." "Always right here." Julie sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing hair that had started falling out in patches from the medication they could barely afford. Medication that worked, but not well enough. Not without the specialists and the advanced treatments that remained just beyond their reach. "How are you feeling?" Tired, really tired. His eyes, so much like hers, searched her face with the wisdom children gain when sickness steals their childhood. "Is Dad home yet?" The question landed like a physical blow, but Julie's smile never wavered. That skill she had perfected over months of pretending everything was fine, while her marriage crumbled and her son's health deteriorated. "He had to go away for a while, sweetheart. But I'm here. I'm always here." Raymond nodded, accepting this with the resignation of a child who had learned not to ask too many questions, and Julie read him 3 chapters from his favorite book about warriors who never surrendered. Her voice steady and strong, while inside her chest something fundamental was reshaping itself, hardening into something that would never break again. The phone call had come 6 hours earlier, while she sat in the clinic waiting room with Raymond, sleeping against her shoulder. His fever finally broken after 2 terrifying days. The voice on the other end was professional, congratulated her with words that felt surreal, informed her that after 18 months of preparation, proposals, revisions, and presentations that had consumed every spare moment she had, her company had been selected. The contract was hers, the largest infrastructure project the government had awarded in recent history, the kind of opportunity that transformed lives and legacies, the validation of every sacrifice she had made. She had wanted to scream with joy, to call Ken immediately, to share this impossible victory with the man who was supposed to be her partner. Instead, she had whispered her thanks, asked them to send the paperwork to her lawyer, and held her sleeping son closer, understanding even then that something was wrong, that Ken's distance over recent months had been leading somewhere she had refused to see. Now she understood exactly where it had led. The paperwork told its own story in cold legal language. Ken had filed for divorce 3 weeks ago, right around the time she was making her final presentation to the government panel, right when she was fighting to save their son's life and secure their future simultaneously. He had claimed irreconcilable differences, requested no alimony from her, demanded no custody of Raymond, wanted nothing except freedom from the life they had built together. He had signed away his son without hesitation, and that truth cut deeper than any affair could. Julie picked up her phone, scrolled through the messages she'd been too busy to read, found the ones from her best friend Tatiana sent over the past week. "Call me immediately." I found something. Then Julie, please. It's about Ken. And finally, the most recent one, sent just 2 hours ago. I'm so sorry. You deserved better than finding out this way, she dialed. Tatiana answered on the first ring, her voice tight with controlled fury. Where is he? Julie asked, surprised by how calm she sounded, how empty of emotion. The Meridian Lofts, downtown, top floor. He's been living there for 6 weeks with Colette Winters, the social media influencer with the ridiculous lifestyle posts. He's been spending money like it's endless, Julie. Your joint savings is gone. The college fund you started for Raymond, gone. The emergency medical fund, completely drained. He liquidated everything he could touch and moved it into accounts with her name attached. Julie looked at the divorce papers again, saw Ken's signature scrawled across the bottom with flourish, saw how he had signed away any claim to her assets, her company, her future earnings. He thought he was divorcing a struggling business owner, barely making ends meet. He had no idea the contract existed because she had kept it confidential, because government projects required discretion until they went public, because she had learned years ago that Ken stopped listening when she talked about her work, dismissing it as a hobby that kept her busy while he handled the real world. He had bet everything on leaving her with nothing, and he had lost in ways he could not yet comprehend. Julie, are you there? What do you want me to do? I can make his life hell. One phone call and everyone will know what he did. No. Julie's voice was steady, final. Let him think he won. Let him believe he made the smart choice. Don't tell anyone about the contract yet. When it goes public, I want him to find out the same way the rest of the world does. Tatiana was quiet for a moment, then laughed, sharp and approving. You're terrifying when you're calm. I love it. What about Raymond? I'm taking him to Fairhaven tomorrow. Dr. Pierce agreed to see him. The real treatment starts next week. Fairhaven? Julie, that's the most exclusive pediatric hospital in the country. How are you? Tatiana stopped, understanding flooding her silence. The contract changes everything, Julie finished softly. Ken left us the day everything changed. He walked away from the winning lottery ticket because he was too busy chasing fool's gold. After they hung up, Julie walked back to Raymond's room, sat in the chair by his bed, and watched her son sleep. The room was small, the paint peeling in one corner, the carpet worn from years of use, but it had been filled with love and sacrifice and hope. Tomorrow they would leave it behind for something better, somewhere her son could heal properly. But tonight she let herself feel the weight of everything Ken had stolen. Not just money or partnership, but the chance to celebrate this moment together, the opportunity to stand united in their greatest triumph. She picked up a pen, signed the divorce papers with steady hands, her signature elegant and decisive, granting Ken his freedom without a single word of protest. Let him have his mistress, his illusions, his shallow victories. She had something infinitely more valuable, a son who needed her, a fortune that would secure his future, and a rage so cold and pure it had crystallized into something unbreakable. Julie looked down at Raymond, his small chest rising and falling with effort, and made a promise in the darkness of their modest apartment, a vow that would reshape everything that came after. No one will ever underestimate us again. The words hung in the air like prophecy, and somewhere across the city, in a luxury loft paid for with stolen money, Ken Maxwell raised a glass of champagne with Colette Winters, laughing about his escape from a failing marriage, celebrating his new beginning, completely unaware that he had just destroyed himself in ways that would echo for years, unaware that the woman he abandoned was about to become untouchable, and that the son he discarded would grow up knowing exactly what his father chose when it mattered most. Chapter 2. The Fortress Rises. The morning the contract went public, Julie stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Raymond's new hospital suite at Fairhaven Medical Center, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of amber and gold, and felt something close to peace settle over her exhausted shoulders. Behind her, Raymond slept in a bed that adjusted to his every need. Surrounded by equipment that monitored his vital signs with technology she had only read about in medical journals, in a room decorated with murals of galaxies and nebulas that some artist had painted by hand. The transformation had happened with brutal efficiency. One phone call to Dr. Finnegan Pierce, the man whose research papers she had studied during Raymond's darkest nights. The physician whose waiting list stretched impossibly long, but who cleared his schedule within hours once he understood the urgency and the resources now available. One meeting where Julie sat across from him and laid out Raymond's complete medical history, held nothing back, showed him every failed treatment and every small deterioration, and watched this brilliant man's face shift from clinical interest to personal investment. "Your son is going to be my proof of concept," Dr. Pierce had said, his Irish accent softening words that carried the weight of promises. "I've been developing a treatment protocol that combines immunotherapy with targeted genetic modification, but it requires resources most families cannot access. You're giving me the chance to save your boy and prove this can work for thousands of others." Now, 3 weeks after Ken had walked out of their lives, Raymond was receiving treatment that existed at the cutting edge of medical science, and the change was already visible. His skin had regained some color. The constant exhaustion that had made him seem decades older was lifting. And yesterday he had laughed at something a nurse said, a real laugh that came from his belly, the kind Julie had not heard in so long she had almost forgotten the sound. Her phone vibrated with the notification she had been anticipating. The government's official press release had gone live. Within minutes, her personal phone started flooding with calls and messages from numbers she did not recognize. Reporters and journalists and industry leaders all suddenly desperate for her attention, her insights, her story. Across the city, in the overpriced loft that was bleeding Ken's stolen savings dry with every passing day, the television mounted on the pristine white wall displayed the morning financial news. And Colette Winters stood in the kitchen making her elaborate breakfast, smoothie when Ken's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor in an explosion of ceramic and liquid. Julie's face filled the screen, professional and composed in a navy suit that spoke of quiet power, standing beside government officials as they announced the largest infrastructure contract awarded in recent memory. The numbers scrolled across the bottom of the screen, figures so large they seemed abstract, impossible. The kind of money that transformed lives and built dynasties. "Turn it up," Ken said, his voice strangled. Colette looked at the screen, saw the woman Ken had described as a struggling entrepreneur playing at business, and watched her world realign with sickening speed. She had pushed Ken to divorce Julie, had made him believe she came from old money and connections that would elevate his status, had painted pictures of a future where they moved in circles of power and influence. Every word had been performance, carefully constructed lies designed to hook a man she thought was on the verge of breakthrough success. "That's Julie." Colette's voice was flat. "Your ex-wife Julie? The one you said was barely keeping her company alive?" Ken could not speak. He stood there watching the woman he had abandoned accept congratulations from officials whose names carried weight in rooms where decisions shaped nations. Watched her smile with genuine warmth as she discussed her vision for sustainable infrastructure and community impact. Watched her command attention without demanding it. The reporter asked about her personal life, whether she had family support during such a demanding project. Julie's smile shifted, became something cooler, more distant, an expression Ken had never seen on her face during their marriage. "I have my son, and that's all the family I need. Some people are blessings in your life, and some are lessons. I'm grateful to finally know the difference." The words were delivered with such calm finality that Ken felt them land like physical blows. She had moved on completely, had shed him like dead skin, and the realization that he meant nothing to her anymore, that he had become less than a memory, hollowed him out in ways the divorce papers never had. Colette was already calculating, her influencer mind working through angles and opportunities. You need to call her, apologize, say you made a mistake. She's a billionaire now, Ken. Do you understand what that means? I threw away the lottery ticket, Ken said, the words bitter ash in his mouth. I threw it away and you helped me set it on fire. Excuse me? Colette's voice went sharp, dangerous. Nothing. It's nothing. But Ken's hands were shaking as he picked up his phone, scrolled to Julie's number, the number he had called 10,000 times during their marriage, and pressed dial. The call went directly to a recorded message, professional and impersonal, informing him this number was no longer accepting his contacts and to direct all communication through legal representatives. She had blocked him, had anticipated this moment, and closed the door before he could even knock. At the hospital, Tatiana Wells walked into Raymond's suite carrying a tablet, her expression somewhere between furious satisfaction and protective concern. She had served multiple tours in places most people only saw on news reports, had planned operations that saved lives and eliminated threats, and she brought that same strategic precision to everything she did. He's been calling 17 times in the last hour. Tatiana held up the tablet showing the blocked call logs. His mother called 6 times, his brother twice. Even his former business partner tried reaching out, probably hoping to salvage something from the wreckage. Julie took the tablet, scrolled through the desperate attempts at contact, and felt nothing. The woman who would have answered those calls, who would have accepted hollow apologies and empty promises, who would have considered forgiveness because she still believed in the man she married. That woman had died the night she found divorce papers on her kitchen counter while her son fought for his life. Delete the logs. Block any new numbers associated with him. I want complete silence. Julie handed the tablet back. How's the company transition going? Tatiana's smile was sharp as broken glass. The office space you leased is perfect. Floor-to-ceiling windows, enough room to expand, and most importantly, visible from Ken's old office building. He's going to watch your empire rise from the ashes of his failure every single day. I didn't choose the location for revenge, Julie said quietly. No, you chose it because it's the best strategic position in the financial district. The revenge is just excellent bonus structure. Tatiana sat down, her voice softening. How are you really doing? Not the strong mother, not the brilliant executive. You, how are you holding up? Julie looked at Raymond sleeping peacefully. His small body finally relaxed in ways it had not been for months, and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had changed. I'm surviving. Some days that's triumph enough. He destroyed everything you built together, abandoned his sick child, stole your savings, and walked away thinking he upgraded his life. Tatiana's voice carried controlled fury. You don't have to be okay with that. You're allowed to be angry. I'm not being gracious. I'm being strategic. Julie turned from the window, her expression hardening into something that would have made Ken's blood run cold if he could see it. Rage is useful when it's controlled, when it's focused into action rather than reaction. He's expecting me to lash out, to make public statements, to drag him through the mud. Instead, I'm going to build something so magnificent that his absence from it becomes his punishment. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Pierce entered, his face carrying the kind of cautious optimism doctors learned not to express too freely. The treatment is taking hold better than I projected. Raymond's immune response is stabilizing. The inflammation markers are dropping significantly, and his energy levels should start improving noticeably. I want to be conservative with predictions, but if this trajectory continues, we're looking at full recovery rather than management. Julie felt her knees weaken, grabbed the window frame for support. Full recovery? You said management was the best we could hope for. I said that when we were limited by resources and conventional treatment options, we're not limited anymore. Dr. Pierce smiled, genuine warmth breaking through professional reserve. Your son is going to run and play and live without constant medical intervention. He's going to have the childhood his condition stole from him. After he left, Julie stood at Raymond's bedside, smoothed his hair with gentle fingers, and let herself cry for the first time since the divorce. Not tears of grief or loss, but release. The emotional pressure of months of terror finally escaping now that safety was real and tangible. Tatiana stepped outside to give her privacy, pulled out her phone, and made a series of calls that would reshape the professional landscape Ken had once inhabited. Not revenge, just information sharing. Colleagues who needed to know that Ken Maxwell had embezzled from joint accounts, had abandoned his critically ill child, had demonstrated patterns that made him radioactive in their circles. By sunset, Ken's already struggling consulting firm had lost 3 more clients, and every door Ken thought might remain open had quietly closed. Julie stood at the window as darkness fell, watching lights flicker on in buildings where people went about their lives unaware of seismic shifts happening in hers, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. Tatiana, I want to establish a foundation. Pediatric autoimmune research specifically focused on making cutting-edge treatments accessible to families who can't afford places like Fairhaven. You're turning his abandonment into legacy. I'm making sure his cruelty serves a purpose beyond destroying us. Julie looked at her son, peaceful and healing. Ken thought leaving me meant escaping responsibility. Instead, he created someone who will spend the rest of her life making sure no child suffers because their father chose selfishness over family. Raymond stirred, opened his eyes, smiled at his mother with a brightness that had been missing for far too long. Mama, Dr. Pierce says I might be able to go to regular school soon. Real school with other kids. I know, baby. Everything is changing. Everything is getting better. Because Dad left? The question was innocent, curious rather than accusatory, and Julie chose her words with care. Because we learned to build our own happiness instead of waiting for someone else to provide it. Raymond considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything, then nodded. I like our new family, just us. It feels safer. And in those words, spoken by a child who had learned too young that biology meant nothing without loyalty, Julie found validation for every choice she had made. Across the city, Ken sat alone in the loft that felt emptier by the hour. Colette, having gone out with friends she refused to introduce him to, and stared at his phone, at Julie's number that would never connect again, and finally understood what he had lost. Chapter 3. The Mistress shows her true face. The cracks in Colette's performance started showing before Ken was ready to see them. Hairline fractures in the fantasy she had constructed so carefully that he had mistaken it for reality. She stayed out later each night, came home smelling of expensive cologne that was not his, scrolled through her phone with focused intensity that spoke of business rather than pleasure. Her social media stories featured champagne brunches at restaurants Ken could no longer afford, designer shopping trips funded by mysterious sources, poses with men whose watches cost more than everything Ken owned. When he asked where the money came from, she laughed, that tinkling sound he had once found charming and now recognized as condescension wrapped in performance. Sponsorships, darling. Brand partnerships. Some of us know how to monetize our presence. What she did not say, what became clearer with each passing day, was that her presence required association with success. And Ken Maxwell was rapidly becoming the opposite of that. His boutique consulting firm, the one he had built on Julie's connections and the reputation she had helped establish through years of introducing him at industry events, was hemorrhaging clients with the efficiency of a severed artery. Damien Cross called the meeting for a Tuesday morning at the office they could barely afford to keep, and Ken arrived to find his business partner already packing personal items into boxes, his movements carrying the finality of someone who had already made irreversible decisions. "We're done." "Ken." Damien did not look up from the framed degrees he was wrapping in newspaper. "I'm dissolving the partnership effective immediately. You can't just walk away." We built this together. No, you destroyed this alone. Damien finally met Ken's eyes, his expression carrying none of the easy friendship that had characterized their relationship. I've received 14 calls in the last 2 weeks from clients wanting to know if I was aware of your personal conduct. They're not interested in working with someone who embezzled from joint accounts to fund an affair while his child was dying. That's the narrative out there, Ken, and I'm not going to let your choices sink my career. Julie's been talking to people. She's sabotaging me. Damien laughed, sharp and ugly. Julie hasn't said a word publicly. She doesn't have to. The facts speak for themselves, and people talk. You stole from your family medical fund to impress a woman who wouldn't look at you twice if you were broke. And now you are broke. And guess what's about to happen? Ken knew. He had known for days, but refused to acknowledge it. The same way he had refused to acknowledge that Colette's affection had always been transactional, that her love was contingent on his ability to provide access to a lifestyle she craved but could not afford on her own. I want my 50% bought out by end of month, or I'm selling to the highest bidder. Damien closed the last box with tape that screamed finality. I've already received 3 offers from competitors who would love to absorb our client list. Well, my client list now, you're scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on. After Damien left, Ken sat in the empty office that had once represented his professional pride, surrounded by furniture they had selected together, awards they had won through collaboration that now felt like ancient history. His phone rang. Colette's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment Ken considered not answering, preserving the illusion just a little longer. Where are you? Colette's voice was ice wrapped in honey. Office. Damien just dissolved the partnership. Silence stretched between them, and Ken could almost hear her mental calculations, the way she was reassessing his value like a commodity whose price had just crashed. I see. Well, I'm having lunch with Harrison Keller. You remember him, right? The tech entrepreneur we met at that gallery opening. Ken remembered. Harrison Keller, whose net worth made Ken's former finances look like pocket change, who had been overly friendly with Colette in a way that Ken had found threatening, but had dismissed because he believed Colette when she said Ken was her priority. Why are you having lunch with him? Because he asked, and because unlike some people, I know how to maintain valuable connections. The sweetness in her voice was toxic. Don't wait up. I might be late. She hung up before Ken could respond, and he sat there holding his phone, staring at the blank screen, finally seeing what Julie must have seen months ago. The moment she realized the person she loved had already left, long before the physical departure. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, Imogen Maxwell, the woman who had never hidden her disappointment that her son married a woman she considered beneath their family's social standing. Your father and I saw the news about Julie. I hope you're satisfied with your choices. You had a diamond and traded it for glass. Ken tried calling his mother, desperate for some form of support, even if it came wrapped in criticism, but she did not answer. His younger brother Wesley did, though, his voice carrying disappointment so profound it felt like grief. I can't believe what you did, Ken. Raymond is asking about you, you know. Julie told me when I called to check on him. Your son doesn't understand why his father disappeared when he needed him most. And what am I supposed to tell him? That his dad is a coward who chose a woman he barely knew over his own flesh and blood. You've been talking to Julie? But the betrayal stung worse than it should have. Of course I've been talking to Julie. She's still family to me, even if you threw that away. She invited me to Raymond's birthday celebration next month. The biggest party of the season, apparently. Athletes, entertainers, business leaders all coming to celebrate a little boy who survived because his mother refused to give up on him. Wesley's voice cracked. You're not invited, in case you were wondering. He's my son. Biology doesn't make you a father. Staying does. You left. Wesley hung up, leaving Ken alone with truths he had been avoiding. That night, Colette came home well past midnight. Her lipstick smudged, her hair slightly disheveled. smelling of wine and decisions Ken did not want to acknowledge. She walked past him without speaking, went straight to the bedroom they shared, and locked the door behind her. Ken slept on the couch that cost more than he could afford, surrounded by luxury, purchased with money stolen from his son's medical fund, and felt the full weight of his choices settle over him like a burial shroud. Morning came with harsh sunlight and harsher reality. Colette emerged from the bedroom with suitcases, her expression carrying none of the affection or desire that had once made Ken feel chosen, special, worthy of the sacrifices he had made. "I'm moving out. Harrison has a place in the penthouse district, and he's offered me a room until I figure out my next steps. You're leaving me for him." Ken stood up, his body aching from the uncomfortable couch, his pride aching from wounds that kept deepening. "I'm leaving you because you're not who I thought you were. You sold me a fantasy about being this rising star, this man who was about to break through to the next level. You failed to mention that the only reason you had any success was because your wife was brilliant and generous enough to share her connections with you." Colette's smile was cruel in its honesty. "Julie was your lottery ticket, and you were too stupid to realize it until after you tore it up. I loved you. I left everything for you. You loved the idea of me, the young, beautiful woman who made you feel like you were somebody important. You loved the validation, not the person, and I played along because I thought you had something valuable to offer." She picked up her bags, moved toward the door with the confidence of someone who had already moved on mentally. "You want to know the really pathetic part? Julie never tried to destroy you. She didn't have to. You destroyed yourself the moment you chose ego over family." Colette paused at the door, turned back with something almost like pity in her eyes. "Your ex-wife is a billionaire who's about to change the world. Your son is thriving in the best medical care money can buy, and you're here alone, broke and bitter. That's not Julie's revenge. That's just consequences." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the period at the end of a sentence Ken had written himself, and he stood in the expensive loft that he could no longer afford, surrounded by furniture that would be repossessed, wearing clothes bought with money stolen from his son, and finally saw himself as the world saw him. Not a man who made a mistake, but a man who made a choice, and that choice had revealed exactly who he was when it mattered most. His phone buzzed, a message from the building management informing him that his rent check had bounced, that he had 5 days to make payment or face eviction proceedings. Ken looked at his bank account, saw numbers that made his stomach drop, and realized he had nowhere to go except back to his mother's house, where disappointment and judgment would be served with every meal. He scrolled through his contacts, past names of people who no longer answered his calls, past colleagues who had blocked him, past friends who had chosen Julie's side because her side was the only side that made sense, and stopped at Raymond's pediatrician, the one from the underfunded clinic they used to visit. Ken called, was put through after a long hold, asked how he could get information about his son's current treatment. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're not listed as an authorized contact anymore. Ms. Randall removed your access to Raymond's medical information when the divorce was finalized. If you have questions, you'll need to go through legal channels." Even his son's health information was closed to him now, and Ken understood with devastating clarity that he had not just lost his family, he had lost the privilege of being part of their story. Across the city, in a sprawling estate that overlooked the water, Julie stood in Raymond's new playroom and watched her son build structures with blocks, his hands steady, his energy returning, his laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. He was healing in ways that transcended medicine, rebuilding himself in an environment where he felt safe and valued and loved without condition. "Mama, look, I made a hospital." Raymond pointed to his creation with pride. "So other sick kids can get better like me." Julie knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his small frame, and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This moment, This simple joy of watching her son play without pain, without fear, without the shadow of abandonment hanging over them. This was worth more than any fortune. "You have the biggest heart, Raymond. Just like your mama." Tatiana stood in the doorway, smiling at the scene before her. "Just like the people who stay," Raymond corrected, his child's wisdom cutting through to truth that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. And in that correction, Julie heard the epitaph of her marriage and the birth cry of something stronger. Chapter 4. The Son Becomes the Warrior. Raymond's transformation was not just physical, though the changes there were remarkable enough to make Dr. Pierce quietly weep during one examination when the boy ran the length of the hallway without stopping, without wheezing, without the exhaustion that had defined his young life for so long. The real transformation was happening somewhere deeper, in the architecture of who he was becoming, shaped by his mother's strength and the harsh lesson that love is proven through presence, not promises. Julie brought Raymond to her office on mornings when he felt strong enough, not to show him off, but to show him possibility, to let him see that power earned through brilliance and perseverance looked different than power taken through cruelty or inheritance. He sat in the corner of her massive office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, working on puzzles and reading books about engineering and space exploration, occasionally looking up to watch his mother command rooms full of executives who hung on her every word. "Why do they listen to you so carefully?" Raymond asked one afternoon, his curiosity genuine and unfiltered in the way only children's questions can be. "Because I know what I'm talking about, and I don't waste their time pretending I know things I don't. People respect honesty and competence more than they respect confidence without substance." Julie sat beside him, grateful for these moments of teaching. "Your father was very confident, but he built his confidence on other people's work. That's a house built on sand, baby. It falls down the moment the tide comes in." Raymond considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Is that why he left? Because the tide came in?" "Something like that. He thought leaving before we saw his house fall would make him look smart. Instead, everyone just saw him run." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Ananya Kapoor entered, the legendary engineer who had fled India decades ago with nothing but brilliance and determination, who had built an empire through genius that could not be denied no matter how much the world tried to dismiss her. She was ancient and elegant, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp enough to cut through steel and soft enough to see potential where others saw problems. "So this is the famous Raymond." Dr. Kapoor sat down across from the boy with the kind of respect adults rarely showed children. "Your mother tells me you're interested in how things work." Raymond nodded, suddenly shy in the presence of this formidable woman. "Good. The world needs more people who ask questions. I brought you something." She pulled out a small electronic kit, the kind used to teach basic circuitry and programming. "This is how I learned engineering when I was young. You build it wrong, it doesn't work. You build it right, you make something that didn't exist before. No shortcuts, no excuses, just you and the laws of physics." Over the following weeks, Dr. Kapoor became Raymond's unofficial mentor, treating him not as a sick child to be pitied, but as a mind to be challenged. She gave him problems that seemed impossible, let him struggle and fail, taught him that failure was just information about what didn't work, that every wrong answer brought you closer to the right one if you paid attention. Raymond thrived under her instruction in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. He started asking questions that made the adults around him pause and really think, started seeing patterns and connections, started building confidence that came from genuine capability rather than empty praise. "He has your mind." Dr. Kapoor told Julie one evening, after Raymond had successfully completed a project that took some teenagers months to finish. That same relentless logic combined with creative thinking. "He's going to be formidable when he grows up, assuming you don't coddle him." "I'm not coddling him. I'm protecting him." "Protection and preparation aren't the same thing." "You're preparing him beautifully. He's learning that the world can be cruel, that people you love can fail you, but that he has the capability to build his own security. That's the greatest gift you can give a child who's been abandoned. Julie took Raymond to their new home that evening, the sprawling estate she had purchased not for ostentation, but for space, for room to breathe and heal and become whoever they were meant to be, without the constraints of their former life. Raymond's room was a sanctuary designed specifically for him, with built-in bookshelves filled with adventures and science, a telescope by the window for stargazing, a dedicated space for the electronic projects Dr. Kapoor assigned him, and most importantly, a lock on the door that only he controlled. "Why did you give me a lock?" Raymond asked when he first saw it. "Because this is your space, and you deserve to feel completely safe here. No one enters without your permission, not even me. You control who gets access to your world now." Raymond had cried then, understanding in the way children sometimes do that this was about more than a bedroom lock, that his mother was teaching him about boundaries and autonomy and the right to protect himself from people who claimed to love him but demonstrated otherwise through their actions. They established new routines in their new life. Weekend mornings were for volunteering at the children's hospital where Raymond had been treated, where he read stories to younger patients who were fighting their own battles, where Julie funded entire research wings and treatment programs that would help families who could not afford what she could. Raymond was gentle with the other children, understanding their fear because he had lived it, offering comfort without pity because pity would have insulted him when he was in their position. A documentary filmmaker named Sienna Grace asked permission to film their volunteer work, and Julie agreed only after ensuring Raymond understood he could say no, that his story belonged to him, and no one else had the right to tell it without his consent. Raymond agreed because he wanted other kids to know they could survive, that being sick didn't mean being broken, that having a parent leave didn't mean being unlovable. The resulting short film was raw and beautiful, capturing moments of genuine connection between mother and son, showing Julie's strength without making her a saint, showing Raymond's vulnerability without making him a victim. There was a scene where Raymond told a young girl whose father had stopped visiting after her diagnosis that his daddy left too. But he learned that real strength comes from the people who stay, not the people who go, and that sometimes losing someone shows you who you really needed all along. The documentary went viral, won awards at film festivals, made Julie and Raymond even more beloved to a public hungry for stories of resilience and authentic love. It also meant that Ken could no longer pretend his abandonment was a private matter, could no longer control the narrative or paint himself as anything other than what he was. Ken watched the documentary alone in the single room he now rented after being evicted from the loft. After his mother refused to let him move back home, after every door closed and every bridge burned, he watched his son speak with wisdom that should have been shaped by a father's guidance, watched Julie's quiet strength that he had mistaken for weakness, watched the life they built without him, and understood for the first time that he was not missed. He was replaced not by another man, but by peace, by stability, by a life built on foundations that didn't crumble the moment things got difficult. Ken tried to write a letter to Raymond, filling pages with apologies and explanations that rang hollow even to his own ears. He talked about making mistakes, about being lost, about wanting another chance to be the father he should have been. He did not mail it. What was the point? Raymond had already learned the most important lesson Ken could ever teach him, that blood means nothing without loyalty, that being a father requires showing up, that some absences are blessings disguised as abandonments. Instead, Ken kept the letter in his wallet, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear the paper, carrying it like a talisman of shame, a reminder of the man he revealed himself to be when his son needed him most. Raymond, meanwhile, flourished. He started attending a private school where teachers recognized his intelligence and challenged him appropriately, where he made friends with children whose parents hadn't abandoned them, who taught him through their normal family dynamics what healthy love looked like. He joined the science club, built robots and conducted experiments, came home excited about learning in ways that made Julie's heart sing. One evening, while they stargazed from their backyard observatory, Raymond asked the question Julie had been waiting for. "Do you think Dad is happy now?" Julie looked at her son, at his face illuminated by starlight, and chose truth over comfort. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I know that happiness built on hurting other people doesn't last. Real happiness comes from being proud of who you are, and your father made choices he can never be proud of. That's a heavy thing to carry. I used to be sad that he left. Now I'm just glad you stayed." "I will always stay, Raymond, always. That's not a promise, that's a fact. You're stuck with me." Raymond smiled, that bright, genuine smile that had been so rare during his illness, and returned his attention to the telescope, searching for constellations with the same focus he brought to everything, already becoming the man he would be, shaped by loss but not defined by it, strengthened by survival rather than weakened by abandonment. And Julie watched her son, her warrior, her greatest achievement, and knew that Ken's leaving had been the cruelest gift, the destruction that made room for something better. The absence that proved presence was everything. Chapter 5, The Empire Expands. The Fool Contracts. Julie's company exploded into adjacent markets with the kind of organic growth that business schools would later study and attempt to replicate, never quite understanding that her success came not from aggressive expansion strategies, but from genuine excellence executed consistently. The infrastructure contract was just the beginning, the foundation upon which she built something that would outlast her, employing thousands and improving millions of lives through work that mattered beyond profit margins. She was invited to speak at international summits, consulted by governments looking to modernize their aging systems, featured on magazine covers not because she sought attention, but because her work demanded recognition. The interviews were always the same. Journalists asking about her meteoric rise, searching for secrets or shortcuts, disappointed when she explained that excellence was built through preparation, perseverance, and refusing to accept mediocrity, even when it would have been easier. One particular interview, conducted by a respected journalist named Helena Moss for a publication that shaped global conversations, became defining. "Your personal life has been the subject of much speculation," Helena said, her approach direct but not cruel. "You finalized your divorce the same week your contract was announced. Some people believe the timing was strategic. The timing was his choice, not mine. He filed for divorce while our son was fighting for his life in an underfunded clinic. He left before he knew about the contract, before he understood what we had built together. That tells you everything you need to know about his judgment and his character." Julie's voice was measured, factual. "I don't discuss him because he's not relevant to my story anymore. He's a footnote in someone else's cautionary tale. Do you have any message for people going through similar situations? Abandonment, betrayal, having to rebuild while caring for a sick child?" Julie looked directly into the camera, speaking to the mothers and fathers and partners who were drowning in their own versions of her former life. "You're stronger than you know, and the people who leave are showing you who they are. Believe them. Don't waste energy trying to make them stay, or understand, or apologize. Use that energy to build something they can never touch, can never diminish, can never claim credit for. Your peace is the greatest revenge, and your success is the final proof that they were never essential, just temporary." The interview went viral, sparked conversations across social media, became a rallying cry for people who had been left behind and were learning to thrive anyway. Julie received thousands of messages from strangers sharing their stories, their survival, their gratitude for seeing someone turn abandonment into ascension. Ken watched the interview from the community library where he spent his days now. using their free internet because he could no longer afford his own, and felt each word land like a physical blow. She was not attacking him directly, but her truth was more damaging than any accusation could be. She had erased him from her narrative completely, reduced him to a lesson learned, a mistake corrected, a problem solved by his own departure. His mother, Imogen, saw the same interview from her comfortable home where Ken was no longer welcome, and called him for the first time in weeks, her voice carrying disappointment so profound it felt like grief. "I raised you better than this, Kenneth. Your father and I taught you about responsibility, about honor, about standing by your commitments, even when they're difficult." What happened to that man? He realized he was miserable, Ken said, defensive and desperate. Miserable? You were married to a brilliant woman who loved you, who shared her success with you, who gave you a son you didn't deserve. You weren't miserable, you were selfish, and there's a difference. Misery is a condition. Selfishness is a choice, and you chose it repeatedly until you destroyed everything good in your life. Imogen's voice cracked. Your brother has been invited to Raymond's birthday celebration. Half the city will be there, apparently. Athletes, entertainers, business leaders, all coming to celebrate a little boy who survived because his mother refused to give up. You won't be there. You'll be wherever you are now, alone with your choices. And I hope that teaches you something. She hung up, leaving Ken staring at his phone in the silence of a library filled with strangers who did not know him, who could not judge him, who offered the only privacy he had left. Wesley called later that evening, his voice gentle in ways that hurt worse than anger would have. "I visited Raymond today. He's incredible, Ken, smart and funny and so thoughtful. He asked about you, wanted to know if you were okay, hoped you found happiness somewhere. That's the kind of person he's becoming, and you're missing all of it." He asked about me. Hope flared, painful and desperate in Ken's chest. Once, in passing, the way you might ask about a distant relative you barely remember. You're not a presence in his life anymore, just an absence he's learning to accept. Wesley sighed heavily. Julie's done an amazing job protecting him from bitterness. She doesn't talk badly about you, doesn't poison him against you, just lets the facts speak for themselves. That's worse than if she hated you, you realize that? She's so far past caring that you don't even register as important enough to hate. After Wesley hung up, Ken walked the streets of a city that used to feel like home and now felt like a museum of his failures. He passed the restaurant where he proposed to Julie, the park where they used to take Raymond before he got sick, the office building where his consulting firm used to operate before Damien dissolved everything and sold the client list to competitors. His phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague, someone he had considered a friend back when friendship came easy because success made him likable. Saw Julie's interview. She's handling everything with incredible grace. Hope you're doing okay, man. The message was polite, distant, the kind of thing you send to someone you feel obligated to acknowledge but have no real interest in supporting. Ken did not respond. What could he say? That he was living in a single room barely bigger than Raymond's old bedroom? That he was applying for positions he was overqualified for and still getting rejected? That Colette had gotten engaged to Harrison Keller, posting photos of a ring that cost more than Ken had made in his best year? Captions about finding real love after wasting time on people who weren't worth it. He walked past the gates of Julie's estate. Those towering iron barriers that might as well have been 1,000 miles high, and saw lights blazing from every window, heard music and laughter floating over manicured grounds where his son lived a life Ken would never be part of. Security cameras tracked his movement. Guards appeared from nowhere, politely but firmly, suggesting he move along before they called the police. Ken moved along, as he always did now, as he would always do, perpetually outside the life he had once inhabited, watching through barriers he had built himself. The next morning, the city's social pages were filled with preparations for Raymond's birthday celebration. The event having grown from a child's party into a significant charitable function where Julie planned to announce major funding for pediatric research. The guest list read like an attendance sheet for power and influence. But more importantly, it included every child from Raymond's former underfunded clinic, their families, their doctors and nurses, everyone who had supported them when resources were scarce and hope felt impossible. Ken read about it online, saw the announced entertainment and activities, saw photos of the venue being transformed into something magical, saw quotes from Raymond about wanting to celebrate with people who cared about other people, who understood that being healthy was a gift you shared by helping others get healthy too. His son had grown into someone Ken barely recognized, someone shaped by values Ken had failed to demonstrate, someone becoming extraordinary despite having a father who had proven himself expendable. That was the final truth Ken could no longer avoid. He was not necessary. His absence had not damaged Raymond or Julie, had not limited their potential or diminished their joy. They had not just survived his leaving, they had thrived because of it. Proof that he had been dead weight they were better off shedding. Ken looked at his reflection in the darkened screen of his phone and saw a stranger, someone he used to be but could never be again, someone who had made choices that could not be unmade and must be lived with every day for the rest of a life that stretched out lonely and bitter and exactly as deserved. Chapter 6. The Birthday Party That Broke a Man. The day of Raymond's 7th birthday celebration arrived with perfect weather, the kind of crisp autumn morning that felt designed for joy, and Julie stood on the terrace of their estate, watching the final preparations unfold below, while Raymond still slept, exhausted from his excitement the night before. The venue had been transformed into something between a wonderland and a learning center, featuring interactive science exhibits staffed by educators who made knowledge feel like adventure, performance stages where musicians and magicians would blend entertainment with inspiration, and quiet spaces for children who got overwhelmed easily, complete with sensory-friendly accommodations, because Julie remembered how overwhelmed Raymond had been at parties before his illness taught him about limitations. The guest list had grown beyond Julie's initial vision, but she had allowed it because Raymond wanted his celebration to be inclusive rather than exclusive. Wanted children who never got birthday parties because their parents worked multiple jobs or because illness isolated them from normal childhood experiences. 200 invitations had been sent, and every single one had been accepted, because turning down an invitation from Julie Randall had become socially impossible. But more importantly, because the event promised to be genuinely meaningful rather than superficially impressive. Tatiana appeared beside Julie with coffee and a tablet showing the final security briefing. Everyone is accounted for except the people who matter least. Ken has been flagged by perimeter security. Apparently he tried to gain access through the service entrance an hour ago, was denied, and has been sitting in his car down the street ever since. He's watching, Julie said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact she had anticipated. Do you want him removed from the area entirely? I can have security escort him far enough away that he can't see anything. Julie considered this, weighing cruelty against mercy, and chose the option that served Raymond rather than her own satisfaction. Let him watch. Let him see everything he gave up. Sometimes the clearest lessons come from being forced to witness what you destroyed. Raymond woke to a room filled with balloons and presents from people who had learned to love him through his mother's work and his own gentle spirit, and his face split into the kind of pure joy that made everything Julie had endured worthwhile. He opened gifts with the careful attention of a child who understood that generosity was a gift in itself, reading every card, thanking people he had never met for their thoughtfulness, demonstrating the grace Julie had worked so hard to model. "Mama, this is too much," Raymond said, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of celebration. "This is exactly right. You deserve to be celebrated, Raymond, not because you survived, but because of who you're becoming." Brave and kind and curious about everything. Those are things worth celebrating. The party began at noon, and guests arrived in waves of genuine enthusiasm. Athletes Raymond admired came and spent real time with him. Not the perfunctory photo opportunities celebrities usually provided, but actual engagement, playing games and answering questions, and treating him like someone worth knowing rather than someone to be endured. Musicians performed songs they had written specifically for the occasion. Scientists demonstrated experiments that made children scream with delight, and through it all, Raymond glowed with happiness so pure it made Julie's chest ache. Dr. Pierce arrived with his entire research team, presenting Raymond with a plaque that read, Honorary Research Assistant, and explaining that Raymond's case had advanced their understanding of autoimmune treatment in ways that would help thousands of children. Raymond accepted this with the seriousness it deserved, shook hands with each researcher, asked intelligent questions about their work, and made them all laugh when he suggested they name their next breakthrough treatment after his favorite cartoon character. The moment that broke the internet happened organically, unplanned by Julie, but perfectly aligned with who Raymond was becoming. A young girl named Isadora, one of Raymond's former clinic companions who was still fighting her own illness, sat alone near the edge of the party, overwhelmed by the noise and activity. Raymond noticed, excused himself from a group of other children, and sat beside her in companionable silence until she was ready to talk. Cameras captured the moment, not because anyone staged it, but because Raymond's empathy was so genuine it demanded documentation. "Are you okay?" Raymond asked quietly. "It's loud, and I'm tired, but I didn't want to miss your party. Want to see something cool? There's a quiet room inside with telescopes and books about space. We could look at stars even though it's daytime. There's special equipment that makes it possible." They disappeared together, and Julie followed at a distance, watching her son share his love of astronomy with a girl who needed gentleness more than excitement, who needed someone to understand that not all children recovered the same way, that some battles took longer than others. The documentary filmmaker captured this too, the raw authenticity of children supporting each other through circumstances they should never have to face. Outside the estate gates, Ken sat in his deteriorating car, close enough to hear the music and laughter, far enough away to be completely excluded. He watched guests arrive in luxury vehicles, watched Julie greet everyone with warmth and grace, watched his son command attention without demanding it, watched the life he could have been part of unfold without him. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, social media flooded with photos and videos from the party, people tagging Julie and Raymond, marveling at the celebration and the genuine love that permeated every moment. Colette's account was among the posts, showing her engagement ring prominently while gushing about how important it was to surround children with positive role models and authentic love. Completely ignoring her role in destroying Raymond's family, Ken watched a live stream someone had posted, saw Raymond give a short speech that had clearly been practiced, but still maintained childlike authenticity. "I want to thank my mum for being the strongest person I know. She taught me that when bad things happen, you have two choices. You can let them make you mean, or you can let them make you kind. I choose kind, like her. And I want to thank everyone here for coming to celebrate with us. And I want to announce something my mom and I decided together." Julie joined Raymond on the small stage, put her hand on his shoulder, and let him continue. "We're donating a lot of money to the clinic where I used to go, the one that couldn't afford the fancy treatments, but had doctors and nurses who cared about me anyway. Every kid should get fancy treatment and people who care, so now they will." The crowd erupted in applause, and Raymond beamed, and Julie felt tears threatening despite her determination to remain composed. This was what mattered. Not revenge, not proving anything to Ken, but creating meaning from suffering, transforming abandonment into legacy, teaching her son that pain could be purposeful if you refused to let it poison you. The party continued into evening, Fireworks painting the sky with colors that could be seen for miles. Music and laughter and joy that felt earned rather than purchased. Through it all, Raymond was the center of attention, but never overwhelmed by it. Grounded by his mother's presence and the genuine affection of people who had learned to love him for who he was, rather than who his family had become. Photographer captured a moment that would define the entire day. Julie and Raymond dancing together, her face pressed against his hair, his arms wrapped around her waist. Both of them lost in the simple perfection of being together. The photo showed everything words could never convey: the strength of their bond, the joy of their survival, the completeness of their family, despite its unconventional size. That photo was everywhere by midnight, shared millions of times across platforms, discussed in ways that transcended celebrity gossip, and touched something fundamental about family and loyalty, and what it means to stay when staying is hard. It also meant that Ken's abandonment was no longer a private failure, but a public spectacle, his absence rendered more painful by the obvious thriving of the people he left behind. The party ended with Raymond exhausted and happy. Surrounded by presents, he insisted on organizing immediately because Dr. Kapoor had taught him that discipline was how you honored gifts. Julie tucked him into bed, listened to him recount every detail of his day with the enthusiasm of a child who had been given exactly what he needed. "Mama, did my dad know about the party?" "I imagine he heard about it, sweetheart. Do you think he wished he was here?" Julie chose her words carefully, balancing truth with kindness. "I think he wishes a lot of things now that are impossible to have. But we can't spend our time worrying about what he wishes. We can only control what we do, and today we chose joy. That's always the right choice." Raymond accepted this, already drifting towards sleep, his last words barely audible. "I'm glad he left, Mama. I wouldn't want to share you with someone who didn't appreciate you." And in those words, spoken by a child wise beyond his years, Julie found peace with everything that had happened, understanding that sometimes the cruelest abandonment leads to the greatest freedom. Ken drove away from the estate hours after the party ended, after the last guests departed, after the lights dimmed and his son went to sleep, celebrated and loved and completely content without him. He drove through a city that felt hostile now, past buildings where he used to work, past apartments he used to afford, past the life he used to live, and understood with devastating finality that there was no going back, no redemption arc, no moment where Julie would forgive him, and Raymond would run into his arms, and everything would be repaired. He had destroyed his family with choices that could never be unchosen, and watching them thrive without him was the punishment he would carry for the rest of his life. Chapter 7. The Systematic Dismantling. Julie never spoke Ken's name in public forums, never gave interviews discussing him specifically, never engaged in the public destruction that would have been so easy and so satisfying for her to orchestrate. She did not need to. Her success was his punishment, her happiness his torture, her complete indifference his ultimate defeat. But the world was not as circumspect as Julie, and the systematic dismantling of Ken Maxwell's reputation happened, organically through the actions of people who had been waiting for permission to speak truth about a man they had always known was hollow at his core. Damien Cross, Ken's former business partner who had dissolved their firm and sold every salvageable asset, appeared on a podcast about ethical business practices and spoke with the freedom of someone who had nothing left to protect. The host asked about partnerships that failed spectacularly, and Damien needed no more invitation than that. "I worked with a man who I thought was a visionary, someone who understood our industry and had the connections to build something meaningful. Turns out his vision was borrowed from his wife, and his connections were hers, not his. When she left, everything collapsed because there was no foundation. He had built his entire professional identity on someone else's brilliance, and when that brilliance was no longer available for him to exploit, he had nothing. But the worst part wasn't the professional failure. It was watching him embezzle from joint accounts from his son's medical fund to impress a woman who saw him as a stepping stone rather than a destination. That's not a business failure, that's a character failure, and those are much harder to recover from. The episode was downloaded millions of times, shared across professional networks, cited in business ethics courses as an example of how moral bankruptcy led to financial bankruptcy. Ken's name was never mentioned, but everyone knew exactly who Damien was describing. And the few remaining professional opportunities Ken had been quietly pursuing evaporated completely. Imogen Maxwell, Ken's mother, who had always carried herself with the rigid dignity of someone who valued appearances above all else, granted an interview to a society columnist who had covered their family for decades. The columnist asked about Imogen's philanthropic work, her family, her thoughts on legacy and generational success. Imogen's response was surgical in its precision. I raised my children to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, that family is sacred, and that your word means everything. My youngest son has become a celebrated architect whose affordable housing projects are transforming communities. My oldest son destroyed his family while his child was dying, stole money that was meant to save his son's life, and proved that bloodlines mean nothing without character to sustain them. I grieve the man he could have been, and am ashamed of the man he chose to become. His ex-wife, a woman he never deserved, has shown more grace and strength than he ever demonstrated, and she will always be more family to me than he is. The interview was devastating, precisely because it came from Ken's own mother. Because her disappointment was so profound, it overrode the familial loyalty that typically protected even the worst children from parental criticism. Ken read it alone in the single room he rented in a neighborhood far from anything he used to know, and felt what little remained of his dignity crack and crumble. Wesley, Ken's younger brother, who had maintained contact with Julie and Raymond despite Ken's abandonment, became an unofficial bridge between the worlds, attending Raymond's school functions, birthday parties, holiday celebrations, fully integrated into their lives, while Ken remained permanently outside. Wesley never spoke publicly about Ken, but his presence in Julie's life spoke volumes, demonstrating that family was a choice rather than an obligation, that loyalty had to be earned and maintained through action. Ken's attempts to find employment became increasingly desperate and increasingly futile. Every interview ended the same way. Initial interest based on his resume from before, then the subtle shift when they Googled his name, saw the articles and social media discussions, understood that hiring Ken Maxwell meant inviting judgment and controversy that no position was worth. He was radioactive in ways that transcended professional incompetence, his personal failures making him unemployable even for positions he was overqualified for. He took work where he could find it, day labor and gig economy positions that paid barely enough to cover rent and food, jobs that left him exhausted and bitter, working alongside men who had always struggled rather than men who had fallen from previous heights. They were kind to him in ways that hurt worse than cruelty, sharing their lunch, offering advice about surviving poverty, treating him as one of them without knowing he used to look down on people in their position. One afternoon, while working a moving job for a company that asked no questions and paid in cash, Ken found himself loading furniture into a truck outside a building he recognized. Julie's office, the new headquarters of her expanding empire, glass and steel and modern architecture that spoke of confidence and permanence. He kept his head down, hoping no one would recognize him, and focused on the heavy lifting that made his back scream and his hands blister. Ken? A voice he recognized, soft with surprise and something like pity. He looked up into the face of Eliza Torres, someone who had worked under him at his old firm, who he had mentored and promoted and genuinely cared about before everything collapsed. She was dressed in professional attire that indicated significant success, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had continued rising while he fell. "Eliza, hey!" Ken wanted to die, wanted the ground to open and swallow him, wanted to be anywhere except here, reduced to physical labor outside his ex-wife's office, while his former employee witnessed his humiliation. "I heard things were difficult for you. I didn't realize," she trailed off, too kind to finish the sentence. "You make choices and you live with them." Ken tried to sound philosophical rather than broken, failed completely. "Julie's been incredible to work with. She hired me last year to head up one of her new divisions. She's nothing like you described her back when—" Eliza stopped again, realizing she was making it worse. "When I was lying about her to justify leaving?" "Yeah, I know. She's extraordinary, and I was too stupid to recognize it until after I threw everything away." Ken hoisted another box, his muscles shaking with effort and exhaustion. "I'm happy for you, Eliza, genuinely. You deserve success, and I'm glad you found it with someone who actually appreciates talent." She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the moment, but they both knew there was nothing to say that would not be patronizing or false. She touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of sympathy he did not deserve, and disappeared into the building where she belonged, while he remained outside where he deserved to be. That evening, Ken walked past the public park, where Julie had announced a major initiative to upgrade facilities in underfunded neighborhoods, one of a dozen charitable projects she had launched that transformed her from successful businesswoman into genuine philanthropist. There was a plaque commemorating the donation, Julie's name and Raymond's name beside each other, mother and son building legacy together, while Ken's name appeared nowhere except in cautionary tales about moral failure. He sat on a bench in that renovated park, surrounded by families enjoying spaces his ex-wife's generosity had created, and tried to remember who he used to be before he made the choices that led here. The man who married Julie had believed in partnership, had valued family, had understood that success meant nothing without people to share it with. That man had been real once, but Ken could barely remember him now, could not access whatever had motivated him then, could not understand how he had transformed from that person into this one. His phone buzzed. An unknown number, but he answered anyway, desperate for any human contact that did not involve judgment or pity. "Mr. Maxwell, this is Henderson Legal Services. We're calling regarding outstanding debts in your name. Our client is prepared to pursue legal action unless payment arrangements are made immediately." Ken hung up without responding, added the number to a long list of creditors he was avoiding, and stared at the families around him living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of their own worst decisions, and envied them with an intensity that felt like grief. Across the city, in their estate overlooking water that reflected sunset colors, Julie and Raymond sat at dinner, discussing his school project about family trees and what family meant beyond biology. Raymond had created a tree that included Julie at the center, branches extending to Tatiana, Dr. Pierce, Dr. Kapoor, Uncle Wesley, and a dozen other people who had proven their loyalty through presence rather than genetics. "My teacher said most kids include their dad," Raymond mentioned casually, curious rather than upset. "Most kids have dads who stay. You have people who chose to be in your life, and that's more valuable than someone who has to be there because of blood." Julie cut his food into smaller pieces, a habit she could not break, even though he was perfectly capable of doing it himself. "Do you think he's sorry?" "I think he's drowning in regret. But regret without change is just self-pity, and self-pity doesn't earn forgiveness." Julie met her son's eyes, made sure he understood this lesson that would serve him for life. People who hurt you will often feel bad about hurting you once they face consequences. That doesn't mean they deserve another chance to hurt you again. Your compassion is a gift, Raymond, but gifts should only be given to people who respect their value. Raymond nodded, absorbing this wisdom the way he absorbed everything. with the seriousness of someone building a worldview that would either protect or destroy him, depending on what he learned now. He returned to his homework, drawing careful connections between the people who mattered, and did not notice that his mother was crying. Quiet tears of relief that her son was being shaped by truth rather than bitterness. That abandonment had taught him discernment rather than distrust. Ken would never know about this conversation, would never understand that his son had processed his absence and moved forward without the damage Ken assumed would be inevitable. He would spend the rest of his life imagining Raymond broken by his leaving, needing him, damaged in ways that required Ken's return to repair. He would be wrong, and that wrongness would be his greatest punishment. The understanding that he was not necessary, that his son was better off without him, that he had not inflicted permanent damage, but rather offered an opportunity for Julie to demonstrate the kind of love that actually mattered. The systematic dismantling of Ken Maxwell was complete, not through Julie's intervention, but through the natural consequences of a man who revealed himself as hollow when pressure exposed his core. His empire, such as it was, collapsed. His reputation dissolved. His family rejected him. His friends abandoned him. His son thrived without him. And through it all, Julie built something beautiful on the ruins of what he destroyed. Proof that sometimes the best revenge is refusing to be broken by the people who tried to break you. Editor 8, The Son's Reckoning, Raymond's 8th birthday, arrived with less fanfare than the previous year's celebration. Not because Julie's resources had diminished, but because Raymond himself requested something smaller, more intimate, focused on the people who mattered most, rather than the spectacle that had defined his 7th year. They celebrated at home, with 24 guests, mostly Raymond's closest friends and their families, the researchers and medical staff who had saved his life, and the handful of adults who had proven themselves through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. The change in Raymond over the past year was remarkable to everyone except Julie, who had witnessed his transformation day by day, and therefore could not see how extraordinary it truly was. He had grown taller, his body finally catching up to where it should be after years of illness stunting his development. His hair had grown back thick and healthy. His energy seemed boundless, and most importantly, his spirit carried a confidence that came from surviving rather than from being protected from hardship. Dr. Pierce pulled Julie aside during the party, his expression carrying the kind of news that physicians rarely got to deliver. "I'm releasing Raymond from my care, not because he needs someone else, but because he doesn't need me anymore. His condition is in complete remission. His immune system is functioning normally, and every marker we track is exactly where it should be for a healthy child his age. He's not just surviving, Julie, he's thriving. You saved his life by refusing to accept limitations," Julie cried, right there in her kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of children laughing and cake being served. Cried the way she had not allowed herself to cry during the dark months when she did not know if Raymond would survive, let alone thrive. Dr. Pierce held her while she broke apart with relief and gratitude and the overwhelming recognition that they had made it through the impossible and come out the other side intact. Later, after the cake had been eaten and presents opened and guests had departed, Raymond sat with his mother on their terrace and asked the question she had been expecting for months. "Do you think I should try to talk to my dad?" Julie's instinct was to protect him from more disappointment, to spare him the inevitable rejection or hollow promises. But she had learned that protection sometimes meant allowing pain if the lesson was valuable enough. "Do you want to talk to him?" "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about me, if he's sorry, if he wants to know who I'm becoming." Raymond picked at a loose thread on his shirt, the nervous gesture he reverted to when discussing difficult topics. "But then I remember that he left when I was sick, and if he cared about who I was becoming, he would have stayed to find out." "That's very wise." "Sweetheart, Dr. Kapoor says wisdom is just pattern recognition. I recognize the pattern of someone who leaves when things are hard. And I know that pattern doesn't change just because things get easier. Raymond looked at his mother with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. I'm not sad about it anymore. I'm just aware, like knowing the sky is blue. It's just a fact. You don't owe him anything, Raymond. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even acknowledgement. Your emotional energy belongs to you, and you get to decide who deserves access to it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness fell. Two people who had learned that family was built through choice and consistency rather than biology and obligation. Raymond had become someone extraordinary, not despite his father's absence, but because his mother filled that absence with love that did not depend on anyone else's participation. The documentary about their journey had continued generating attention, leading to speaking invitations and interview requests that Julie usually declined on Raymond's behalf. But when a children's advocacy group asked if Raymond would consider speaking to kids who had parents who abandoned them, Julie let Raymond decide. I want to do it, he said, after thinking for several days. Not because I'm special, but because I was them and I survived. And maybe that matters to someone who thinks they won't. The speaking event was held at a community center in an underfunded neighborhood, the kind of place where hope came in scarce supply, and children learned early that adults often failed them. 50 kids attended, ranging in age from 6 to 16, all dealing with some form of parental abandonment, all carrying wounds that would shape them for better or worse, depending on what they learned to do with the pain. Raymond stood at the front of the room, looking impossibly small in front of so many hurting children, and spoke with honesty that adults 3 times his age struggled to achieve. My dad left when I was really sick. He took all our money to be with someone else, and I thought that meant something was wrong with me, that I wasn't good enough to make him stay. But my mom taught me that people leave because of who they are, not because of who you are. And the people who stay, even when it's hard, those are your real family. A teenage girl in the back raised her hand. Do you miss him? Sometimes I miss the idea of having a dad, but I don't miss him specifically because the person I thought he was never really existed. I was missing someone I made up in my head, not the actual person who left. An older boy, maybe 15, asked the question they were all thinking. Do you hate him? Raymond considered this carefully, the same thoughtful approach he brought to everything. I don't hate him. Hate is like carrying poison and hoping it hurts someone else. But I don't need him either, and that's more powerful than hate. He thought leaving would hurt us, but it just showed us who we really are without him. And we're pretty amazing. The children absorbed this, some crying, some nodding, all processing their own versions of abandonment through Raymond's truth. Julie watched from the side of the room, her heart simultaneously breaking and swelling with pride, understanding that her son had transformed his pain into purpose, his abandonment into advocacy, his suffering into strength that could help others. After the event, a young girl approached Raymond, maybe 7, with braids and eyes that had seen too much sadness. My daddy left too. Mama says he's not coming back. Then your mama is being honest with you, and that's good. The worst part isn't them leaving, it's waiting for them to come back when they won't. Raymond knelt to her level, this boy who had learned empathy through experience rather than instruction. You know what helped me? Building a life so good that if he ever did come back, I wouldn't want him to mess it up. The girl smiled, small and uncertain but real, and wandered back to her mother, who was crying silently in the corner, grateful that her daughter heard from someone who understood. That night, someone posted video from the event, and it spread across social media with the velocity of content that touches universal pain. Raymond's words were quoted, shared, discussed, held up as an example of how children can survive parental failure if given proper support and honest truth. Ken saw the video 3 days later, forwarded to him by someone he did not know, with a message that said simply, "Your son is remarkable despite you." He watched Raymond speak with wisdom and confidence and clarity, watched him help other children process abandonment, watched him turn the worst thing Ken had ever done into something meaningful and helpful and profound. Ken tried to write another letter, filling pages with apologies and explanations and desperate pleas for a chance to know his son. He wrote about regret and change and understanding, about how he had been lost and selfish and wrong, about everything that mattered. He wrote until his hand cramped and his vision blurred. And then he tore it all up because he finally understood what Julie had been trying to tell him through her silence. Raymond did not need his apologies or explanations, did not need anything from him at all, had built a complete and beautiful life without Ken's participation or approval. The realization was devastating in its completeness. Ken had not just lost his son. He had revealed himself as unnecessary, as disposable, as someone whose presence added nothing and whose absence created space for better things to flourish. That was worse than being hated or missed, being irrelevant to people who had every reason to center their lives around him. Raymond, meanwhile, continued thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible during his illness. He excelled academically, particularly in sciences and mathematics, showing the same analytical brilliance his mother possessed. He made friends easily, the kind of genuine connections built on mutual interest and respect rather than social positioning or parental pressure. He volunteered weekly at the hospital where he had been treated, reading to younger patients and offering comfort that only someone who had been through similar darkness could provide. Dr. Kapoor continued mentoring him, pushing him harder than anyone else would dare, treating him like a colleague in training rather than a child to be coddled. Under her guidance, Raymond had built several impressive projects, won regional science competitions, and developed a reputation in educational circles as someone exceptional to watch. "Your son is going to change the world," Dr. Kapoor told Julie one evening after a particularly intensive mentoring session, not because of what happened to him, but because of how he chose to process it. He learned early that suffering can make you bitter or better, and he chose better. That's the rarest kind of wisdom. Julie knew Dr. Kapoor was right, could see the shape of the man Raymond was becoming, and understood that Ken's abandonment had been the cruelest gift, the destruction that cleared space for Raymond to be shaped by people who actually understood excellence and character. That night, while Raymond slept peacefully in his room, surrounded by books and projects and evidence of a life well lived, Julie stood at her window looking out over the city and felt complete in ways she had not felt during her marriage. She had built something extraordinary from the ruins of Ken's betrayal, had transformed abandonment into ascension, had proven that the best revenge was refusing to be diminished by people who tried to destroy you. She thought about Ken occasionally, wondered if he understood yet what he had lost, if he grasped that his son was becoming someone remarkable without any guidance or presence from him. She hoped he did, hoped the understanding was as painful as it deserved to be, hoped he spent the rest of his life watching from the outside while Raymond flourished within the fortress she had built. But mostly, she did not think about Ken at all, had moved so far past him that he barely registered as a presence even in memory. And that indifference was the final victory, the ultimate proof that he had been wrong about everything that mattered. Chapter 9. The False Prophet Returns. Ken's descent into complete destitution happened gradually. Then suddenly, the way financial collapse always does for people who keep making terrible decisions while hoping for different outcomes. The single room he rented became impossible to afford when the gig economy work dried up, when his body could no longer handle the physical labor, when younger and stronger men competed for the same desperate jobs. He spent 3 nights sleeping in his car before the car was repossessed. Spent a week in a shelter before the rules and proximity to other people's suffering drove him to the streets. spent a month wandering between missions and soup kitchens, learning the geography of poverty from the inside. He developed a drinking problem, the kind that starts as escape and becomes necessity, that transforms from choice to compulsion faster than most people realize. Alcohol was easier to obtain than dignity, cheaper than hope, more reliable than the few remaining people who might have helped him if he had asked. He did not ask. Pride was the last thing he had left, and he clutched it tightly, even as it prevented him from accessing the few lifelines still available. Winter came early and stayed late, and Ken found himself in the public library during operating hours, using their computers to search for his son's name, reading articles about Raymond's accomplishments and Julie's expanding empire, seeing photo after photo of lives lived beautifully without him. It was masochistic, this obsession with tracking people who had moved on, but he could not stop, could not release his grip on the family he had destroyed, could not accept that they were truly better off without him. He started planning his return the way desperate men always do, with delusion disguised as strategy. He would get clean, get a job, rebuild his life, prove himself changed, demonstrate through action that he deserved another chance. The plan felt real enough in his head, achievable enough to sustain hope. But he never took the first concrete step because taking action would have required admitting the magnitude of change needed. And that admission felt too enormous to face. His mother, Imogen, tracked him down through a private investigator she hired out of maternal concern that overrode her disappointment, and met him at a coffee shop where she paid for his meal and watched him eat with the desperation of someone who had not eaten properly in days. "You need to go to a rehabilitation facility, Kenneth. I'll pay for it. 3 months, maybe 6, whatever it takes to get you stable and sober. I don't need rehab, Mom. I need a chance. I need to talk to Raymond to explain what? That you abandoned him while he was dying so you could sleep with a woman young enough to be his babysitter? That you stole from his medical fund to impress someone who saw you as a walking ATM? What exactly will you explain that makes any of that acceptable?" Imogen's voice was harsh with love that had nowhere productive to go. "Raymond is thriving without you. He's healthy and brilliant and kind, despite having a father who proved those qualities don't run in families. Leave him alone. That's the only decent thing you have left to do. He's my son. I have rights. You signed away your rights when you finalized the divorce. You gave up custody without even asking for visitation. You chose freedom over fatherhood, and now you want to undo that choice because freedom turned out to be lonely." Imogen pulled out an envelope, placed it on the table between them. "This is enough money for first month's rent and deposits at a sober living facility I found. It's not negotiable. You take this help on these terms, or you get nothing from me ever again." Ken looked at the envelope, at the lifeline his mother was extending, at the choice between accepting help and maintaining his delusion of eventual reconciliation with his family. He left the envelope on the table and walked out, choosing pride and fantasy over practical survival, choosing the comfortable lie over uncomfortable truth. That was his final mistake, the one that eliminated his last safety net. The decision that ensured his rock bottom had no floor beneath it. He ended up at a homeless encampment under a highway overpass, surrounded by men and women who had also made terrible choices, but who lacked his advantages, who had started from poverty rather than falling into it. They were kind to him in ways that shamed him, sharing their food and shelter, protecting him from violence, asking no questions about his past because they understood that everyone here had a story they regretted. It was there, in that encampment, that Ken met Dr. Ananya Kapoor by complete accident, an encounter that would strip away his final delusions with surgical precision. Dr. Kapoor was there volunteering with a medical outreach program that provided health care to homeless populations, part of her commitment to serving communities that society preferred to ignore. She recognized Ken immediately, her sharp mind placing his face even though it was gaunt and weathered, his eyes hollow with alcohol and regret. She pulled him aside, away from the others, spoke to him with the brutal honesty that had made her legendary in her field. "You're Raymond's father, the man who left." Ken could not lie, could not pretend, could not access any of the performance that used to carry him through difficult moments. "Yes." "Good. Then you need to hear this from someone who knows your son, who watches him thrive every week, who sees the man he's becoming. Raymond is extraordinary, brilliant beyond his years, emotionally intelligent in ways most adults never achieve, driven by a purpose your abandonment ironically helped create. He wants to become a doctor or researcher, to help children facing what he faced, to transform his suffering into service. Do you understand what that means? That he's strong, that he survived? No." Dr. Kapoor's voice was sharp enough to cut. "It means he transcended what you did to him. He took the worst thing that ever happened to him and decided it would make him better rather than bitter. That's character you didn't teach him, strength you didn't model, wisdom you couldn't provide because you don't possess it. I want to apologize to him, to explain why, so you can feel better about yourself, so you can dump your guilt onto a child who's finally healthy and happy. Your apology serves you, not him. Your explanation centers your feelings, not his well-being. The kindest thing you can do for Raymond is exactly what you've been doing, staying away. I'm his father. Biology is not identity. You're a man who once contributed genetic material. Julie is his parent, the one who stayed when staying was hard, who sacrificed everything to save him, who taught him that family is built through action rather than genetics. You left when things got difficult. That's not fatherhood. That's cowardice with a convenient biological explanation. Dr. Kapoor's words were devastating precisely because they were true, because they articulated what Ken had been avoiding acknowledging, because they removed the last comfortable lie he had been telling himself about eventual reconciliation. What should I do? Get help. Get sober. Get stable. Build a life you can be proud of, even if it's a small life, even if it's humble. Stop obsessing over the family you destroyed and start building something new, something that doesn't depend on forgiveness from people you damaged. Raymond doesn't need your redemption arc. He needs you to be okay somewhere else, living a life that doesn't intersect with his. She left him there, returned to her work with people who wanted help, who were ready to receive it. And Ken sat in the darkness of the highway overpass, understanding that he had finally heard the truth he had been avoiding for years. He was not necessary, not wanted, not needed. His son had become extraordinary without him. His ex-wife had built an empire without him. His family had moved forward without him. He was a footnote in their story, the villain who provided obstacles they overcame, the absence that made their presence more meaningful. That night, for the first time since everything collapsed, Ken did not drink. He sat with his regret, sober, felt every edge of it, let himself experience the full weight of what he had done without the buffer of alcohol or delusion. It was excruciating and necessary, the kind of pain that either breaks you permanently or forces you to change fundamentally. Morning came with unexpected clarity. Ken used the money from odd jobs to access a phone at a community center, called his mother, accepted her offer of help without conditions or pride. He entered the rehabilitation facility she had selected, committed to the work of rebuilding himself, not because he hoped for reconciliation, but because continuing as he was meant dying slowly while still breathing. Treatment was brutal, forcing him to confront not just the drinking, but everything underneath it, all the character flaws and moral failings that had led to his choices. He had to acknowledge that he had not made a mistake. He had revealed who he truly was when tested, and who he was had been deeply disappointing. Months passed. Ken got sober, got stable, found work that paid barely enough but felt honest, moved into a modest apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew his name or his history. He attended meetings, rebuilt something resembling self-respect, learned to live with the knowledge that some damage cannot be repaired and must simply be endured. He thought about Raymond constantly, but did not try to contact him, understanding finally that his desire for connection was selfish, that forcing himself into his son's life would damage Raymond more than permanent absence. He followed his son's accomplishments from a distance, reading articles about academic achievements and charitable work, seeing photos of a young man becoming everything Ken had failed to be, and he accepted, with the kind of painful clarity that comes from hitting absolute bottom, that he would never be part of that story again, that he had written himself out through choices that could not be rewritten, that the best thing he could do for the son he loved was exactly what Dr. Kapoor had prescribed: be okay somewhere else, living a life that did not intersect with his. That acceptance did not bring peace, but it brought something more valuable: accountability without the delusion of redemption, regret without the expectation of forgiveness, understanding without the hope of reconciliation. Ken learned to live in the space between who he used to be and who he could never be again, and some days that was enough to get through. Chapter 10. The Reckoning at the Iron Gates. 3 years after the divorce, Ken Maxwell walked the streets of a city that had once felt like home, and now felt like a museum of his failures, each block holding memories of who he used to be before he made the choices that destroyed everything that mattered. He'd been sober for 14 months, stable for most of that time, working a warehouse job that paid his bills and asked nothing of him beyond showing up consistently. His therapist said consistency was the foundation of recovery, that showing up was how you rebuilt trust, even if the only person learning to trust you was yourself. He had not contacted Julie or Raymond in all that time, had maintained the boundaries Dr. Kapoor had insisted upon, had learned through painful discipline that his desire for reconciliation was about his comfort rather than their well-being. But the knowledge that Raymond's 10th birthday was approaching, that his son was becoming someone extraordinary without any participation from him, that wounds stayed fresh despite his sobriety and stability. Ken stood outside the gates of Julie's estate on an evening in early autumn, not planning to enter or make contact, just standing there like he had done dozens of times over the years, torturing himself with proximity to a life he could never re-enter. The house blazed with light, preparations visible even from the street for what appeared to be a formal dinner party. Luxury vehicles arriving and departing, people dressed in evening wear, moving through rooms that looked like they belonged in magazines. He should have left, should have walked away like he always did, maintained the distance that was the only decent thing he had left to offer. But something in him broke, some final thread of denial snapped, and he found himself approaching the security gate, pressing the intercom button before his rational mind could stop him. "Can I help you?" The voice was professional, impersonal. "I'm Ken Maxwell. I need to speak with Julie Randall." "It's important." Silence. "Then please wait." 10 minutes passed, 15. Ken stood there watching guests arrive, recognizing faces from television and business magazines, understanding that Julie moved in circles now that he could never access even if she wanted him there. He was about to leave, accepting this as the rejection it clearly was, when the gate clicked open and a security officer gestured him through. "Ms. Randall will meet you at the main entrance. Please follow the driveway." Ken walked up the long approach to the house, surrounded by landscaping that had been designed by someone with actual artistic vision, past sculptures and gardens that demonstrated wealth deployed with taste rather than ostentation. The house itself was stunning, modern architecture that somehow felt warm rather than cold, every light positioned to create beauty rather than just illumination. Julie met him at the door, and the sight of her stole what little composure he had maintained. She looked extraordinary, dressed in an evening gown that probably cost more than his annual salary, her hair styled elegantly, her bearing carrying confidence that came from years of proving herself in rooms full of people who had initially dismissed her. But it was her eyes that destroyed him, the complete absence of warmth or recognition. The way she looked at him like he was a stranger whose face she vaguely remembered from somewhere unimportant. Ken. Her voice was neutral, giving him nothing. This is unexpected. I needed to see you, to talk to you. I know I have no right, but please, just a few minutes. Julie glanced back into the house, where laughter and conversation filtered out, then looked at Ken with something almost like pity. You have 5 minutes here. I'm not inviting you inside. She stepped out onto the porch, closed the door behind her, maintaining the barrier between him and the life she had built. They stood in the soft glow of landscape lighting, and Ken saw himself reflected in the windows behind her, a thin and hollow version of who he used to be, standing before a woman who had become magnificent in his absence. I'm sober, he started, the words tumbling out desperately. 14 months. I have a job, an apartment, I'm in therapy twice a week. I know I can't undo what I did, can't take back the choices I made, but I'm different now. I understand what I lost, what I destroyed, and I want a chance to know my son. Not to be his father, I know I don't deserve that, but maybe just to be part of his life somehow. To apologize directly to him, to let him see that I've changed. Julie listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when Ken finished his rehearsed speech, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. I'm glad you're sober. Ken, genuinely, I'm glad you found stability and help. That's good for you, and you deserve to be healthy. She paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight language carried. But Raymond doesn't need your apology or your presence. He's thriving without you, becoming someone extraordinary, and forcing yourself into his life now would serve only your emotional needs, not his. I've changed. I'm not the man who left. Maybe you have changed, but change doesn't erase impact, and the impact you had on Raymond was profound. He learned at 6 years old that his father would abandon him when things got difficult, that biology meant nothing without loyalty, that he couldn't depend on promises from people who claimed to love him. Those lessons shaped him, and he processed them with remarkable grace, but they still hurt him in ways you'll never fully understand. I want to apologize for that, to explain that I was lost and selfish and what? Julie's voice hardened slightly. And that will somehow make it better. Raymond doesn't need your explanations or excuses. He made peace with your absence years ago. You're not a presence in his life anymore, Ken. You're a lesson he learned about who not to become, and that lesson served him well. Ken felt tears threatening, swallowed them back with difficulty. I have rights. He's my son. You signed away your rights when you finalized the divorce. You gave up custody without even asking for visitation. You chose freedom over fatherhood, and you don't get to undo that choice now because freedom turned out to be lonely. Julie's words were calm but final, each one landing with the weight of truth he could not argue against. You want to know the really devastating part? Raymond asked about you exactly once in the past year, asking if you were okay, hoping you found happiness somewhere, even if it wasn't with us. Not because he needed you, but because he has the kind of compassion that worries about people who hurt him. The fact that your son doesn't hate you, doesn't obsess over your absence, doesn't need you to feel complete. That should tell you everything about who he is, despite what you did to him. The truth of it broke something in Ken. The understanding that his son had transcended his abandonment so completely that Ken barely registered as important enough to resent. What am I supposed to do now? How do I live with this? You do what you should have done years ago. Build something meaningful with your own life, instead of trying to reclaim pieces of ours. Be proud of your sobriety, be consistent at your job, be someone you can respect when you look in the mirror. But do it somewhere else, living a life that doesn't depend on forgiveness from people you damaged beyond repair. Ken looked at the house behind her, at the warm lights and sounds of celebration, at the life he could have been part of if he had made different choices. Can I at least see him, just from a distance? I won't approach him, won't speak to him, just see him? Julie considered this, and Ken saw the calculation behind her eyes, the way she was weighing his request against her son's well-being. Finally, she stepped aside slightly, gestured to a large window where the dinner party was visible. Raymond stood among the guests, tall for his age and radiating confidence, engaged in animated conversation with adults who were treating him as an intellectual equal rather than a child to be tolerated. He was laughing at something someone said, his face bright with genuine joy, completely comfortable in this world of achievement and influence, belonging there in ways Ken never had, even during his best days. He wants to be a doctor, Julie said softly. Specifically a pediatric specialist focusing on autoimmune disorders. He wants to help children like he was, make sure they get the treatment he received. Dr. Kapoor says he has the mind for it, the discipline, and most importantly, the compassion. He's going to change lives, Ken. He's going to matter in ways most people never do. Ken watched his son, saw the man he was becoming, and felt pride mixed with such profound grief it took his breath away. He's perfect, he's remarkable, and he became that way because I surrounded him with people who taught him that character is demonstrated through action, that family is built through consistency, that love means staying even when it's hard. You could have taught him those things, but you chose to teach him their opposites. And he learned from that too. Raymond glanced toward the window, and for a brief moment his eyes seemed to find Ken's through the glass. Ken raised his hand slightly, a tentative wave, a gesture of connection across impossible distance. Raymond's expression shifted, recognition flickering across his face, and then he simply turned away, returned his attention to the conversation he was having, dismissed his father's presence as easily as someone might dismiss a stranger. That dismissal hurt worse than hatred would have, worse than anger or pain, because it demonstrated complete indifference. Ken was not important enough to hate, not present enough to matter, just a biological footnote in a story Raymond was writing without him. He saw me, Ken whispered, and he chose not to engage. That's his right, earned through years of learning that your presence added nothing valuable to his life. Julie's voice softened slightly, not with warmth, but with finality. You need to leave now, Ken. Go back to your sober life, your warehouse job, your therapy sessions. Build something you can be proud of that doesn't depend on us. Maybe someday you'll understand that the greatest act of love you can offer Raymond is exactly what you've been doing. Staying away and letting him thrive without the complication of your guilt and need for redemption. I loved you both. I still do. Love, I loved you both. It is demonstrated through action, not feeling. You loved us in the abstract but failed us in practice, and practice is what matters. I didn't lose a husband when you left, Ken. I gained clarity, strength, and a purpose bigger than the small life you imagined for me. Raymond didn't lose a father. He gained proof that he could survive anything as long as he had people who genuinely cared about him. Julie turned toward her door. The conversation clearly finished, but Ken made one final desperate plea. Will you tell him I'm sorry? That I think about him every day? That leaving was the biggest mistake of my life? She paused, looked back at him one last time. No, because your regret is about your comfort, not his healing. He doesn't need to know you're sorry. He needs to keep building a life where your absence doesn't matter, and your apology would only serve to remind him of what he's chosen to move past. Julie disappeared inside, the door closing with a soft click that sounded like the period at the end of a sentence Ken had written himself. Ken stood there on the porch for a long moment, then walked back down the driveway, past the beautiful gardens and sculptures, through the gate that closed behind him with quiet finality. He walked away from the estate, away from the life he had destroyed, away from the people who had learned to thrive without him. The walk back to his modest apartment took 2 hours, his car having been sold years ago, and he spent that time processing what Julie had told him, accepting finally that some losses were permanent, some chances expired, some damage could not be repaired no matter how much you changed afterward. The greatest revenge truly was peace, and Julie Randall had built an empire on it, while the man who underestimated her learned that some women you don't chase because they've already left you behind in every way that matters. Ken understood now that he had not just lost his family, he had revealed himself as unnecessary, and they had proven that truth by becoming extraordinary without him. He would spend the rest of his life carrying that knowledge, learning to live in the space between regret and acceptance, understanding that the best thing he could offer the son he loved was exactly what Dr. Kapoor had prescribed years ago. Be okay somewhere else. Building a life that didn't depend on forgiveness he would never receive. And somewhere in that magnificent estate overlooking the water, Raymond celebrated his 10th birthday, surrounded by people who had earned the right to be there through years of consistent presence. Learning from his mother that the greatest strength is surviving what should have broken you and choosing joy anyway. Never knowing that his father had stood outside the gates one final time, watching through windows at a life he could never re-enter. Finally understanding the weight of choices that can never be unchosen.